these spheres of sulfur, and where they had completely burned up, there was a cavity very similar.
When Ron Wyatt spoke, people either listened or turned away. To some, he was a man of unshakable faith who devoted his life to proving the Bible's truth. To others, he was a dreamer, chasing myths across deserts and mountains. Yet in the final interview before his death, Wyatt set aside the relics and spoke of something else entirely, a warning to humanity he feared would come too late. Do his words really matter nowadays? The final interview. The interview took place in the late 90s, not long before Ron Wyatt's passing. By that time, Wyatt's health had begun to fail. The years of travel, the stress of skepticism, and his relentless drive to defend his findings had taken a visible toll. Yet when he began to speak, the old conviction returned to his voice. He wasn't the animated explorer seen in earlier videos describing biblical sites or artifacts. In this final recording, Wyatt appeared subdued, his voice calm but deliberate. His tone carried no trace of defensiveness, only reflection. Those who later watched the footage remarked on how composed he seemed, as if finally letting go of the need to persuade anyone. "I'm not here to prove anything anymore," he said early in the conversation. "People will believe what they want to believe, but truth doesn't depend on belief." The interviewer, a younger documentarian familiar with Wyatt's work, tried to keep the discussion focused on archaeology, Noah's Ark, the Red Sea crossing, the Ark of the Covenant. But Wyatt gently steered it elsewhere. He wasn't interested in defending measurements or geological samples. Instead, he spoke about what he called the real discovery, what humanity is forgetting. It was a striking shift in tone. The man who had spent decades chasing physical evidence now seemed more concerned about the state of the human spirit. He described a world that had lost its sense of reverence, where faith had turned into debate and knowledge into noise. He spoke quietly about human pride, about how technology had made people certain of everything and grateful for nothing. To him, the search for truth had become a contest rather than a calling. It wasn't a sermon. It sounded more like a confession. The room, according to those present, felt heavy, not with fear, but with understanding. Wyatt wasn't warning of an apocalyptic event or divine punishment. His words felt more personal, even weary. "We keep looking for proof of God's works," he said, "but we ignore the proof of our own decline." When the interview was released after his death, reactions were mixed. Some longtime supporters saw it as his most honest moment, a man of faith finally speaking from the heart instead of the field. But even those who dismissed his archaeological claims admitted something lingered in the tone of that recording, a rare blend of peace and warning, as though Wyatt had accepted that truth's greatest test isn't discovery, but whether humanity still knows how to recognize it. What were his predictions anyway? Humanity's ticking clock. In the final interview, Ron Wyatt no longer spoke of artifacts, coordinates, or excavation details. Instead, he spoke about what he believed those discoveries were pointing to, a larger truth that had less to do with history and more to do with humanity itself. "The evidence was never the goal," he said quietly. "It was a mirror." Wyatt's warning wasn't apocalyptic in the Hollywood sense. There were no predictions of dates or disasters, no visions of fire and judgment. It was subtler, and in some ways more unsettling. He described a world losing its moral bearings, one where knowledge had multiplied faster than wisdom, and faith had turned into a contest of opinions. "We've built a society that can map the stars," he said, "but can't look at its own reflection without distortion." Wyatt's first point was about moral decline, not in the sense of religion versus secularism, but in the loss of integrity and humility. He lamented how truth had become negotiable, shaped by convenience, emotion, or self-interest. When facts stop mattering, he warned, people start believing whatever makes them comfortable. That's when civilizations fall. To Wyatt, this wasn't just a social problem, it was a spiritual one. He often referred to the ancient cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, not merely as examples of sin, but as cautionary tales of a society that normalized selfishness. He saw modern parallels in how humanity justified corruption, inequality, and greed under the guise of progress. The tragedy, he said, wasn't that people had stopped believing in God, it was that they had stopped believing in consequences. The second part of Wyatt's warning was about spiritual blindness, a kind of selective seeing. He reflected on his decades of trying to convince skeptics about the existence of Noah's Ark or the Ark of the Covenant, only to realize that the hunger for proof rarely led to faith. People wanted the photo, not the message, he said. In his eyes, humanity had become obsessed with validation, measuring belief through evidence instead of conscience. Wyatt wasn't against science or reason. He respected both deeply. But he felt that modern thinking had placed humanity at the center of everything, turning discovery into pride rather than humility. We dig into the earth to find the past, he said, but we don't dig into ourselves to find the truth. To him, this imbalance was the beginning of a spiritual collapse. People could prove anything except their own sincerity. Wyatt's third concern was what he called science without faith, the belief that progress alone could solve human problems. He warned that technology, for all its achievements, was slowly replacing discernment. The more we invent, the less we remember why, he said. He worried that humanity's creations, machines, algorithms, digital systems were outpacing its capacity for moral restraint. It wasn't a rejection of science, but a plea for balance. Wyatt saw in the modern world a growing dependence on data and logic, but an emptiness in compassion and accountability. He compared it to the Tower of Babel, not a punishment story, but a parable about ambition without understanding. The tower isn't a building anymore, he said softly. It's the system we live in. Though he rarely spoke like an environmentalist, Wyatt's warning extended to humanity's treatment of the earth. He believed the disregard for creation mirrored a disregard for the Creator. He pointed out how greed and convenience had replaced stewardship, how people took nature's endurance for granted. Every discovery I made, he reflected, was buried. Maybe God knew we'd have to dig to appreciate what we've been given. He spoke, too, about social decay, not just poverty or conflict, but indifference. To Wyatt, the greatest danger was apathy, people seeing suffering and simply scrolling past it. The opposite of faith isn't doubt, he said. It's indifference. Those who heard the interview noticed that Wyatt never claimed divine revelation. His words carried the tone of a man observing patterns rather than predicting miracles. He didn't claim to know when or how humanity would face its reckoning. He only sensed that it was already unfolding. It's not about the end of the world, he said. It's about the end of our awareness. What made his warning powerful was its simplicity. It wasn't a call to religion or a demand for belief. It was a call to remember, to reconnect moral responsibility with human advancement. He spoke of rediscovering gratitude, truth, and restraint as the foundations of survival. We've mistaken progress for permission, Wyatt said. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. When the interview circulated years later, listeners found themselves struck by how measured his tone was, more sadness than anger, more resignation than accusation. It was the sound of a man who had stopped trying to be right and started trying to be heard. In that calm voice, people heard both hope and exhaustion. Whether one believed in his discoveries or dismissed them entirely, his closing message carried a human truth that transcended faith or science, that a civilization forgetting humility is one already in decline. This time, it's fair to get to know the man behind the message deeper. From faithful explorer to reluctant messenger, Ronald Eldon Wyatt was not a scholar trained in the halls of archaeology or theology. Born in 1933 in rural Arkansas, he lived an ordinary life for much of his early adulthood, working as a nurse anesthetist to support his family. Yet behind that practical career was a consuming fascination with the Bible not just as a spiritual text, but as a map to real places and real events. To Wyatt, the miracles of Scripture were not distant myths, but physical realities waiting to be found, measured, and verified. His interest in biblical archaeology began in the 60s, during a period when televised discoveries from the Middle East sparked public imagination. Unlike professional archaeologists who worked under grants and institutions, Wyatt's explorations were self-funded and deeply personal. He spent his savings and vacation time traveling to Turkey, Egypt, and Israel, guided by scripture, satellite images. To his supporters, this devotion showed a rare blend of faith and courage. To his critics, it was naive, a hobbyist chasing confirmation of stories long regarded as allegory. Wyatt's first and most famous claim came from the Durupınar site in eastern Turkey, a mountain region where local tradition had long connected a boat-shaped formation to the story of Noah's Ark. After several visits beginning in the late 70s, Wyatt announced that the formation's dimensions matched those described in Genesis. He claimed to have used subsurface radar to detect a symmetrical structure beneath the surface, possibly the petrified remains of the Ark. The news drew headlines across Christian media, sparking excitement among believers who saw it as validation of Scripture. Encouraged by the attention, Wyatt continued to pursue what he believed were the material remnants of biblical history. Over the next 2 decades, he announced a series of discoveries that, if verified, would have rewritten the field of archaeology. The true site of the Red Sea crossing, sulfur balls marking the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah, the exact location of Mount Sinai, and even the resting place of the Ark of the Covenant beneath Jerusalem. Each claim came with a blend of physical observations, personal testimony, and biblical reference. Professional archaeologists, however, were unconvinced. Experts in the field pointed out that Wyatt's methods lacked documentation, peer review, and formal excavation permits. Some described his interpretations as pseudoscientific, driven by faith rather than evidence. The Israel Antiquities Authority dismissed his work outright, calling it sensational and unfounded. Even some creationist organizations distanced themselves from his conclusions, wary of defending claims they could not substantiate. Yet the criticism never seemed to deter Wyatt. Those who knew him described a man with quiet resolve, neither combative nor defensive. He did not present himself as a prophet or scholar, but as an ordinary man, following what he believed was a divine calling. He often said his work was not to convince the skeptics, but to strengthen the believers. That distinction defined his career. He wasn't seeking academic recognition, but spiritual affirmation. The personal cost of that conviction was high. He poured his savings into expeditions, often facing bureaucratic resistance abroad and ridicule at home. His family endured periods of financial strain and public scrutiny. But Wyatt's persistence made him a minor celebrity within certain Christian circles, particularly among audiences who longed for tangible proof of the Bible's stories. He became the subject of documentaries, church presentations, and interviews that blurred the line between exploration and testimony. By the 90s, however, a subtle change had come over him. Age and illness began to slow him down, and the weight of decades spent defending his claims was beginning to show. His tone in public appearances grew quieter, less triumphant. He still stood by his discoveries, but began to speak more about what they meant than what they proved. The shift was subtle, but significant, from a man searching for artifacts to one reflecting on the meaning of discovery itself. In his final years, Wyatt seemed to realize that whether or not people accepted his findings, the deeper message had been lost in the noise of debate. It was never about the stones or the wood, he once said. It was about what they were trying to remind us of. To him, the physical remains of sacred history were only symbols of something larger, the moral and spiritual decay of a world too busy arguing over evidence to live by its lessons. By the time of his last interview in the late 90s, Wyatt was no longer the bold explorer trekking across deserts and mountains. He was a weary but thoughtful man, more interested in warning humanity than convincing it. His message had evolved from proof to perspective, from showing that the Bible's stories were real to urging people to recognize what their fading relevance said about us. In that transformation lay the heart of his legacy, not the artifacts he claimed to find, but the uneasy truth he tried to tell about the kind of world that no longer listens. Reaction and controversy. When the recording of Ron Wyatt's final interview surfaced, it spread quietly at first, passed between church groups, small online forums, and independent documentary channels. Unlike his earlier discoveries that had drawn sensational headlines, this wasn't about buried artifacts or lost relics. It was about what he said, and more importantly, how he said it. The tone was so different that even people who had followed his work for years were unsure how to interpret it. For his supporters, many of whom had long defended him against academic dismissal, the interview was seen as a closing statement, not of surrender, but of completion. They admired his humility in those last words. He wasn't claiming anymore, one follower wrote on a ministry blog. He was reminding. Some saw it as his final ministry, one that shifted from evidence of God's works in the ground to evidence of God's absence in people's hearts. But critics were less forgiving. To skeptics and professional archaeologists, Wyatt's final words did not redeem decades of what they saw as unfounded claims. They dismissed the recording as another layer of self-mythology, a way for Wyatt to retreat from failed science and reinterpret his legacy as moral philosophy. A few commentators went further, accusing his followers of using the recording to cement his cult-like status in fringe circles. It's a soft pivot, one biblical scholar said in a later review, from failed archaeology to vague prophecy. Despite the criticism, the interview continued to circulate. Something about its tone, the quiet sincerity, the absence of argument, made it difficult to dismiss completely. Viewers who had no interest in religion found themselves listening to a man confronting his life's work and realizing that the truth he sought could not be unearthed with tools or proof. For some, that honesty was disarming. In the years that followed, clips from the interview were uploaded to social media and reinterpreted in countless ways. Some used it as evidence of a coming moral collapse. Others took it as a general call for humility and reflection. It became one of those rare recordings that meant different things to different people, spiritual for some, philosophical for others. Ironically, Wyatt's final warning created the very division he lamented. The same message that called for understanding and restraint became fuel for debate. Yet even amid the noise, there remained a quiet respect for the man himself. Whether one saw him as a misguided dreamer or a man of deep conviction, his closing words carried the same weight, a reminder that belief, knowledge, and morality are only as meaningful as the humility that binds them. Centuries before Wyatt, figures like Galileo and Copernicus faced ridicule for revealing truths that challenged the world's assumptions. Did Wyatt just copy from the past? Similar warnings through history. Ron Wyatt's final warning, though rooted in faith, echoed a familiar pattern found across history. The lone voice urging humanity to look inward before it's too late. His message about pride, imbalance, and moral blindness didn't belong only to theology. It belonged to a long tradition of thinkers, scientists, and dreamers who recognized that knowledge without wisdom can destroy as much as it creates. Galileo and Copernicus's discoveries expanded human understanding of the universe, but also exposed the fragility of belief systems built on certainty. Wyatt's experience was a mirror image. He was not punished for denying science, but for believing that science should serve faith, not replace it. Both kinds of visionaries, the scientific and the spiritual, faced the same fate when they questioned what society wanted to hear. In the 20th century, Similar warnings came from respected voices within modern thought. Physicist Albert Einstein warned that our technology has exceeded our humanity, a sentiment that could have come straight from Wyatt's lips. Carl Sagan, in Pale Blue Dot, pleaded for humility and stewardship of a fragile planet. Stephen Hawking spoke of artificial intelligence and environmental decline as threats created by humanity's own success. Even Nikola Tesla, often romanticized as a prophet of innovation, feared that unchecked industrial greed would corrupt the purpose of progress. Wyatt's version of this warning carried a religious frame, but its essence was the same: the belief that humanity's downfall begins not with catastrophe, but with forgetfulness. Each of these figures, from scientist to seeker, recognized a repeating cycle: discovery leading to arrogance, and carelessness leading to collapse. What sets Wyatt apart is that his voice came from outside the institutions that shape knowledge. He spoke not from a laboratory or university, but from conviction and personal experience. His appeal wasn't for more data or better theories. It was for humility, reflection, and moral grounding. In that sense, he was less a prophet of doom than a participant in an ongoing dialogue humanity keeps ignoring. A reminder that progress, no matter how brilliant, means little if it leaves wisdom behind. Believe Wyatt or not will be up to the listener. Don't forget to click subscribe for more deep dive contents.